Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday. Friday, yay, woo, Friday, party. I don't know. I feel so enthused about the fact that it's Friday. It's nice. It's Friday, January 10th, 2020. Ooh, 10-20-20. I can't really make anything out of that one. Anyway, I've been up for about 1 million hours. Got up early this morning to make a run to the airport, sending the wife off to Salt Lake City. Hooray! So those of you who are in Salt Lake City, gather around the airport and try to guess who she is and what flight she's coming in on, and I don't know, take her out to dinner. All right, well, it was a rough morning, but I didn't want to have to call a cab early in the morning and deal with that. She was going to drive to the airport, but we're busy killing all the wildlife in our area, as you know, chasing the bat off from the wreath on the front door, and then yesterday she was headbutted by a deer in her car. Yes, unfortunately. We don't know what happened to the deer. You know, you never can really tell in the dark. But interestingly, the deer ran into the side of the car. Wasn't really sure how that happened. Like, I could see how deer misjudge the timing, try to running across the street before a car gets there. But running into the side of a car, well, we figured out the logistics of it finally. She was in the left-hand lane. It skipped by the car in the right-hand lane, but didn't look ahead to the left-hand lane. So I don't know what to tell you. So anyway, car's not totaled or anything, but we're going to have to take it in to get patched up. And what a day. So late into the night worrying about that, and then early in the morning off to a business flight at which required our leaving the house at 5:30 in the morning. Then, come back and try and pretend you're going back to sleep until the kids need to go off to school. So that's the way my morning is going. It's peanuts compared to what's going on out there for presidents who are facing impeachment or fake impeachment trials. Anyway, plenty to catch up on today, and large and small in terms of the size of the stories today. But Bill's given us a start here. Let's start with that and get the feet under us this morning. Daily Coast Radio is live now. That's good news because I'm here. You're here. It's a good thing the radio is here, too. And thank Justice Putnam for that, by the way. And thank him each day. I do silently and in the background. But Daily Coast Radio is live now thanks to Netroots Radio. Kagro X, me, David Waldman, reminds you that Trump still hasn't fixed our national crisis of having to flush 10 to 15 times a day. This is true. He hasn't brought that up since. Just to get our steam dishwashers to work properly. And remember when he was going to bring our aircraft carriers back to steam-powered catapults, of course, right? Sadly, our more perfect union still has a way to go. And yet, all right, I have my faith in the Constitution is total. It is complete. It's just not being listened to. So, this ancient document goes the way of the dinosaurs. Or maybe that's how they plan to get rid of this thing at the end, right? We'll be invoking the Constitution, thinking, of course, that the constitutional originalists will be with us on the other side, only to be answered by an admonition that our sad devotion to that ancient document, something, blah, blah, blah. How does that line go? It doesn't matter because we die within seconds because we're suffocated by Darth Trump. Okay, much to catch up on. Big stories. Long stories, short stories. Does everyone like short stories? There are a number of them out there. Yesterday, Trump had a crazy rally, and I think he chose Ohio possibly to do it in, but I didn't care enough to check where the thing actually happened because it happened in effing crazy town. So what's the difference? And probably one of the worst in terms of just flat out disgusting rhetoric, for which he will never be called out, of course. And that was some of the points that many were making in observing his demeanor yesterday. There was, for instance, I noted that a video clip of him saying, Democrats are horrible, disgusting people. they're the worst, blah, blah. This is generally speaking. Democrats, horrible, disgusting people. And then he says, I guess that's why they hate me so much, because I say things like that. And then just wanders on into more garbage, and everyone just lets that slide. And lots of people pointing out, there was a time when it was a major event for the press for weeks to talk about how horrible it was that Hillary Clinton had once said that half of Trump voters were deplorable, whereas now the answer is every Democrat is horrible. Yeah, here it is. They're vicious, horrible people. They are horrible people. I mean, we could listen to him say it, but I don't know if we want to give them that kind of attention. Jameson Foser pointing out, every pundit and journalist who pretended for weeks that deplorable was an historically over-the-line slur against noble Americans is going to denounce this, right? But they may still be busy crying about Smoky Eye Gate. So I don't know if we're ever going to get our due on that one. But that's just one of many clips of note. Actually, Mike Pence was there doing the warm-up act, I guess, at this rally, and he didn't warm anybody up. Mike Pence is terrible, and one of the worst politicians. I mean, I don't know. He might be fine at getting elected. He strikes me as like I don't know. He's like what an AI engine would generate if you said, "Give me a Republican politician," but before Trump, I would say, and they would give you white guy, short cropped white hair like that, and stupid looking vapid face, and just saying dopey things that excite nobody. And here he is. But apparently he too gave something away yesterday in his speech. Let's see, Aaron Rupar collecting most of the clips and passing them around for everybody. Gotten points for getting the city right yesterday. Wasn't it when we were thinking it was there was a shooting in elsewhere in Ohio, and at the same time also one in Texas, and he combined the knowledge that one of them had happened in Ohio and the knowledge that one of them also had a T involved. I think it was in El Paso, Texas, maybe, where the shooting had happened. And he just decided that he was, extending his sympathies to the people of Toledo. Yeah. This one was actually in Toledo. And where was I? I was reading about the rally in Toledo, and I had just marked the thing, too, so I could share it with you. But I'll go back to Aaron's feed here. Pence begins a Trump rally in Toledo by giving up the game about the Soleimani strike. And here's how, with the quote being, "When one American life was lost at the hands of Iranian-backed militias just a few short weeks ago, POTUS," and I guess he calls them POTUS. I don't know. They might just be abbreviating here. "POTUS launched the first airstrikes against them in 10 years. But he notes, it's a great applause line for deplorables anyway. But so long to the imminent threat claim, right? It was, but they're still doing it. That's one of the things that's so interesting about this crowd, is that they really don't care about their consistency. Others, Dana Hool pointing out here that his entire speechwriting operations must be morons. How does something so obviously against the administration's long-term interests make it all the way to the teleprompter? And the answer is there's a huge disconnect, I think, between Trump's people and Pence's people, for starters. But also, I don't think that Trump's operation knows that you're supposed to coordinate as between speechwriting and policy so that this sort of thing doesn't happen. And I don't think those people talk to one another and they consider that sort of coordination to be bureaucratic red tape, stuff that, stuffy old stupid politicians do, but we don't care anymore. And on top of that, I think that they actually enjoy the freedom not to coordinate this way and to say, the regular rules don't apply to us. And we don't have to make sure that our speeches are consistent with our policy side, because if they aren't, who cares? And we get an extra charge out of, extra kick out of being in conflict and having people say, how could this possibly be? Why are they even allowed to get away with this? And we tie ourselves in knots and tear our hair out, obsessing over it, and they go on their merry way. I think there was a great comment that this now brings me to yesterday that I think I just commented briefly on, retweeted out there for everyone to enjoy. But a comment that was in a different context, but also about how the Trumpsters work, but that I think is applicable across the board. And probably the person who said it, also thought it was applicable across the board and meant it to be that way. Let me see. I got to scroll back a ways to do it. But they were basically commenting on... here we go. So let's see. I had seen Seth Michaels retweeting someone else and then commenting that a third person had something else to say about it. Let's see. Our first comment in the chain here comes from Fyodor, who is Fyodor 32768. And you might think, what a bot. I don't know. I couldn't tell you anything about it. But he happened to make the comment back to Seth about something else. Making bad faith arguments is an important ritual in Republican politics. It demonstrates commitment to the cause and willingness to shutter your ethics. It has affirmative signaling value, even independent of whatever issue you're discussing. And I thought, yeah, that does make a good amount of sense. It certainly explains how they can stand there and lie so obviously about so many things, and plays into the cult nature of Trump followers, etc. I thought that made good sense. What was he responding to? I should go further back in the tweet here, in the tweet thread. I guess, well, they were talking here about, I don't even know what policy they were working on. It didn't really matter very much, but I thought it was broadly applicable. I guess I won't go too far back here, but that was a nice thought from Fyodor. And Seth saying here in response, as Dorothy Berry, I guess, Dorothy 410 Berry, or Dorothy DC Statehood Now, Fortenberry, there we are, Dorothy Fortenberry, with a what people call a blue check, but which is actually, I was reminded the other day, a white check in a blue field, true, but apparently writer and producer of The Handmaid's Tale, so a famous person of sorts, said, so Seth is pointing out here, as Dorothy Fortenberry is fond of saying, the flimsiness of the excuse is itself a demonstration of power. I thought those were good insights in general, right? Making bad faith arguments is an important ritual in Republican politics. It demonstrates commitment to the cause and willingness to shutter your ethics, like an initiation test of sorts, except it goes on forever. If you're one of us, you will ignore your conscience and say this lie and vote as if you believed it, right? Shutter your ethics. And it has affirmative signaling value, even independent of whatever issue you're discussing. And then Dorothy Fortenberry saying, yeah, the flimsiness of the excuse is itself a demonstration of power. And I think that's broadly applicable. They were talking about something different. I think it applies, for instance, to the lame Iran briefing that made Mike Lee so mad. And I think they're beating him back into shape as we speak, actually. But it applies to the lameness of the Iran briefing. I think Bolton's sudden offer to testify, and I still am not sure that he means it or that he means testimony in the sense that we understand it. It applies to the outright dismissal of the obligations under the War Powers Act, although I guess they've constructed a less flimsy excuse now. I mean, the argument for it, I guess others would say, is kind of flimsy. Their argument is that the War Powers Act is just facially unconstitutional and always has been, and so they're just not going to obey it. But of course, then we have the other problem of, well, you're supposed to obey the law, but you can fight it in court and make your case that it's unconstitutional, but you're supposed to be obeying it while it's on the books. But that has fallen by the wayside as well. Anyway, a lot of very interesting, larger philosophical points that we can mine from the last couple of days. And some more specific points as well, longer stories as well to catch up on. And maybe now is a good time to shift over to that. So I guess, I'm sorry, I had one other shorter story. As I was saying, I think they're beating Mike Lee back into line over this. He's had to spend the last day or so reiterating his personal allegiance to Trump generally, but he's just mad at somebody else who works for Trump, and maybe he got bad advice or something like that. And but there's another drama playing out that I saw. I guess we saw it coming, once I saw that this was happening on the floor of the House yesterday, but I didn't follow up to say, well, what are they going to do about this? Matt Gaetz, one of the craziest and most pro-Trump, generally speaking, members of the younger members anyway of the Republican conference in the House. Yeah, I mean, you all know who he is. Spoke yesterday during the debate on the War Powers resolution, attempting to limit Trump's power to launch retaliatory strikes and get us into a war and to commit the military to this thing he's doing, whatever you want to call it, in the Middle East with Iran. And Matt Gaetz, on the premise that, as he puts it, that he represents more active duty military members, members of the armed forces than any other member of Congress, or in the House anyway. And I'm not certain that that's true, and I don't care to research it. Maybe, it happens that his district is very likely, one of the larger ones in terms of service members. I don't care. Doesn't matter. Anyway, his point was he represents so many members of the active duty military that he, though he supports Donald Trump politically and in almost every possible way, he too was convinced that we needed to be excessively cautious when entering into armed conflict with anybody, but with Iran in particular, and was going to vote for the War Powers Resolution, which did pass, and of course it will be on its way over to the Senate, where I imagine the Republicans will do their best to ignore it and not move it. We'll see whether they're able to do that over the objection of Mike Lee, and if he still continues to support it, and whether Rand Paul does the same, I don't know. Anyway, apparently Gaetz immediately came in for criticism from Trumpsters across the country, and this was noticed by David Weissman, another blue/white Czech personage floating out there, who describes himself as, among other things, a New York Jew in Florida, but that's not going to help you. You're going to narrow it down a little bit better than that. Army vet helps a little. Former Trump-supporting Republican, now liberal Democrat. Oh, okay, we'll find that guy. That's easy. Very interesting. I mean, there's more to his description. Do you want to know? A full-time college student at EFSC. And then says, who cares what MAGA trolls say about me? It turns out he is the line we care about here is former Trump-supporting Republican, now liberal Democrat. And he has to say about what Matt Gaetz went through, or is going through now. The way MAGA has been responding towards Matt Gaetz tonight is exactly what I went through when I was only dialoguing, I guess pondering his transition is what he means here. And after I said I was done supporting Trump, I don't expect or demand Matt Gaetz to leave the Republican Party, the GOP as he puts it, like me. I just hope he sees MAGA for what it is, a cult. And he, I guess, went fishing through the comments to him, as did others who responded to his comment. And suffice to say, it is it would be humorous if it wasn't so sick, I guess. What the response to Matt Gaetz is. We have yet to see how he will react to that. I imagine he's pretty adept at letting the insults roll off his back, and all will be back to normal, as it appears it is going to be for Mike Lee as well. This is, I think somebody in this thread may have made mention of what was going on with Mike Lee and how it was going for him, but maybe not. I saw in passing, and I don't think I could even identify the tweet for you, and therefore the source, but the rumor was that, Mike Lee was starting to walk some of his stridency back. Anyway, looking for wiggle room to get back out the other side of this mini controversy he's created for himself. Anyway, so it's been kind of crazy out there. And I think that's all the fishing in the small stories that I'm going to do before I start combing through for some of the larger stories as well. I guess the big story for us to discuss today is back on the impeachment beat. Big day for the evolution of, or I guess nailing down where McConnell is on the process for the impeachment trial. It was a huge day yesterday for reporters to, to buffet against Nancy Pelosi, trying to nail down her position on this thing. It was a big day for asking questions like, are you going to withhold the articles of impeachment indefinitely? No, I'm not going to do it indefinitely. I know exactly when I'm going to send them over there. But anyway, they basically peppered her with questions until she started to say things like, well, I know when, I have a goal in mind and we'll send them over. I'll probably send them over eventually as soon as we, get to the point where it's time for me to send them. I'll send them. And she finally I think they were looking to get her to say something like so. It feels like a breakdown, but she bounced back from it pretty quickly to say, I'll send them over when we're ready. And I think that'll be pretty soon. So, like I said yesterday, we kind of have to prepare ourselves for that. It doesn't look like she's changing the plan any. And also, as it turns out, it doesn't look like there's any plan at all to subpoena John Bolton in the House. And I'm not certain what that theory, why they're going with that. And the best anybody has been able to say that I've seen so far on Twitter is, basically trust Adam Schiff. He knows what he's doing. And it could be that there's some procedural thinking here, some strategic thinking about the way the cases came down that would make some sense. I just haven't seen it said aloud yet. To me, I see no downside exactly, and I worry a little bit about facing the, whatever little debate there's going to be under the Senate procedure, if there's any at all, over whether or not there's going to be witnesses. I worry that if Democrats or anybody requests that John Bolton testify, well, particularly if Democrats request that John Bolton testify, Republicans will say, not only do we not want him to testify, but you've never made the case as to why he should testify. If Democrats thought he should testify, he should have testified in the House, where Democrats control the procedure and could have subpoenaed him, but they didn't. I don't understand. You had a chance to subpoena him in the House, and you didn't do it, and now you want to make up for that error in the Senate? Well, we're not going to let you do it. But on the other hand, you could point out at some point, well, there's Democrats here in the House and there's Democrats here in the Senate. And we're the ones in the Senate. And we want to hear from John Bolton. The House didn't think it was important, but here in the Senate we do. What's the difference? That's actually a decent question. It won't occur to most reporters who love the games of politics, the game aspect, and it won't occur to most observers who likewise have been trained to see things as a game. And Team Democrat is responsible for the conduct of the impeachment to date, and now Team Republican will drive it from here on in. And so the failures or strategic decisions or whatever they are of the Democrats in the House will, by most observers, I am sure, be imputed to the Democrats in the Senate. Although they're very different people and have different ideas about how things ought to be pursued. And at a different point in the case, you might come to think different things about the value of the testimony of different people. But that's too nuanced an explanation for most people. And so, yeah, I worry very much that they'll be able to reject the call for Bolton's testimony. Well, they're going to do that anyway. I mean, obviously, I guess I'm not too worried about that because it's actually happening. And they're going to say what they say about Bolton's testimony no matter what we do in the House. They'll just say that it was Democrats' fault for doing something wrong. But they'll have a point, which is what bothers me most. They'll be standing there saying they'll be able to launch a hypocrisy attack. When you had the chance to do something, you didn't do it with Bolton, and now you've made a mistake and you realize it and you know you have no case and you want to have him testify in order to save your, in order to save face. Of course, again, that's answerable too, right? I mean, I guess you could say, well, the whole point, you've actually just kind of made our point, is without Bolton's testimony, it's very difficult to tell whether or not the president did anything wrong. With it, it would be obvious that the president had done something wrong, and that's why you won't allow us to call him to give that testimony. But I don't know if that cures the defect of never having called him in the first place. We'll take a 2-minute break. I'll be right back. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday. But our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. We took our 2-minute break to figure out what we were going to do next. We always had some idea, of course. So we got to get back to the impeachment, the rules, everything that's swirling around it. Here's where we stand. So in addition to a little bit of back and forth between Pelosi and the reporters, back and forth between Pelosi and Democratic members of both of the House and the Senate, I was going to say bending to the pressure, but I mean, it was only the slightest breeze in the air about, well, maybe it's been going on too long. And we already, I mean, there's a lot of members of Congress, and they only got like 3 or 4 of them to say, well, maybe it's time. And it was the lamest possible construction, too. There was no reason given, no merit to the argument, just it's time. What time is it? I don't know. It's just, it's time to send them over. And there was no, you couldn't even say, well, it feels like it's been a long time, or we really have to get around to it eventually, or we're not going to win this bargaining exchange or anything. It's time. They didn't have anything to say in favor of the proposition that it was time to send them over, just that it was. It's time because it is time. Anyway, meanwhile, for a little while, there was some doubt about whether or not McConnell had his threatened 51 votes either, well, to do anything. But the threat was to, let's say, adopt at first the threat was, I have 51 votes to adopt a rules package that will preclude calling any witnesses during the trial. And by the way, the nuanced excuse for not calling any witnesses. Well, it wasn't the excuse for not calling witnesses. The excuse for the procedure that he preferred to getting around to the outcome he wanted, no witnesses, was a vote after the commencement of the trial, a vote to be held after opening arguments had been presented by both sides to determine the path for the rest of the trial going forward at that point. In other words, I think what he was looking for was, and he didn't want to describe it this way until he finally did break down and say so. I think yesterday might have been the first time that he clearly outlined that what he contemplated here was opening statements and then a vote to, a series of votes. And that the new clarity here was that one of the votes would be, well, you've heard opening arguments. If you are convinced that this is all a sham and that the president doesn't deserve to have been impeached in the first place, we can vote at this point simply to dismiss the case from here on in. There won't be a vote on guilt or innocence. It's just there's no case made here. We're dismissing it and closing things out, and that's that. And so, therefore, there'll be no witnesses because we're not going to do any more in this trial. Originally, the door was apparently open to the idea that they would have opening arguments and then vote on whether or not to have witnesses. But I don't think that was ever real. It didn't make any sense as a trial structure. It only made sense as, well, will be in effect voting on whether or not to call witnesses by having a vote to dismiss. That's what we'll be having. And he didn't want to say it that way because, I don't know, I guess he thought that the persuasion game for getting his 51 votes in line required something more nuanced. So the excuse became that they were going to use, as they said, use the Clinton rules for the impeachment. That they were going to, and the reason that they were going to use the Clinton rules was because they were adopted by a vote of 100-0. It was a unanimous decision in 1998 to adopt these particular rules, and so obviously it was going to be a great idea to use them again. Never mind again that, 20 years have passed. Many of the senators are different now. Of course, the run-up to the trial is entirely different now. The crimes charged are entirely different now. There's really no reason in the world why the fact that you use these rules for the Clinton impeachment would by themselves recommend them for use for the Trump impeachment, unless the two of them, were similarly situated, and they're not. They're both presidents, allegedly. They've both been impeached, but that's really where the similarity ends. And, I'm sure you could parse some more out of there. Well, both are being charged with obstruction of justice, essentially, right? Yes, that too. That superficially is the same. But the idea was they were going to use the same rules, and the procedure then was that they had opening arguments and then some votes about how to proceed from there. And part of the voting was about witnesses, but as has been pointed out by numerous commentators along the way, there had been already video depositions of witnesses taken, things that hadn't been presented in the House procedure before, leading up to impeachment, and there was general agreement that would go forward, and there were witnesses available. I don't think there ever has been a presidential impeachment where there were no witnesses offered up in any way, shape, or form. This would be the first time that happens, but that's why McConnell was leaning so hard on the idea that this was precedent of some sort, and that's why leaning on the 100-0 vote. That's how strong the precedent was. But it was a 100-0 agreement for an entirely different set of circumstances and an entirely different understanding of what would happen following the opening arguments. So it doesn't really hold up, but nothing that McConnell ever does, ever says really does hold up. So now, anyway, that's evolved to, in addition, now that he's got his 51 votes, and maybe this is what he meant all along, or maybe he's been checking over the last day or so, do I still have 51 if the move is we won't even have opening arguments? We're just going to vote to dismiss this thing outright. And in fact, we now have McConnell on the record saying that he supports the otherwise stupid proposal from, what's his name, Josh Hawley, to dismiss the articles of impeachment for failure to prosecute, essentially. I saw this written up in Axios, and who else did it? Do I want to make a choice as between the two of them? Yeah, The Hill and Axios. Why don't we go with Axios for this one, just because we do The Hill too much. McConnell backs changing Senate rules over Pelosi impeachment delay. And, well, here we go. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has signed on to a resolution, he's co-sponsoring it, by Senator Josh Hawley seeking to change the rules of the Senate to dismiss articles of impeachment if they are not transmitted within 25 days of their approval. In this case, that would be January 12th. And you know how they break their stupid thing down. Why it matters, because impeachment is an effing important thing. But okay. The constitutionality of such a move, whether 12 other co-sponsors have signed on to, is not clear. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi reiterated on Thursday that she's waiting to see what the Senate trial will look like before she names impeachment managers and transmits the articles. Not, by the way, a great position to have taken up early on in the decision to withhold the articles of impeachment. There, I guess it was first, well, we're holding out for the demand for witnesses. And as that began to kind of fall apart, I'm sure other people suggested as well, but I certainly thought that they should move to, well, it makes a great deal of sense. I want to see what the procedure is going to be. I'm not going to pick my team of managers until I see what the procedure is going to be like. And by the way, I thought they maybe missed out on the opportunity to have the fight on these grounds. Why aren't you letting the managers of the case manage the case? How is it that, I see why procedurally you allow the Senate to do this, and constitutionally too, I suppose, but this is about as close to a joint proceeding as you get without being an actual joint session of Congress. And why the managers don't get to manage trial process, I really have no idea. This is where the courtroom analogy breaks down. That the jury gets to tell the prosecution what kind of case they're allowed to tell them about. That doesn't make any sense. But whatever. That's our stupid system. Anyway, yeah. So I liked the idea of shifting the strategy to, well, it's not so much that we're definitely holding out only for witnesses, because that would lead to an impasse probably, but we're also trying to see what kind of team we want to send there based on what they're going to be asked to do. So anyway, we've got that, and then McConnell has said he's got the Republican votes to approve a resolution on trial rules without support from any Democrats, and he has repeatedly criticized Pelosi for attempting to interfere with Senate process, although, like I said, I would be criticizing McConnell for interfering with House process. They're there to present a case as members of the House, and you can't interfere with their duties as members of the House in that way. But so far, no one has offered that argument. The Senate would require 2/3 majority in order to change the rules. Oh, yeah, there's some controversy about that one too. Unless McConnell, of course, were to invoke the nuclear option and decide the issue by a simple majority vote, which the question was, does he have the 51 votes to do that? My question, though, is slightly different. I also wondered whether it was really the case that he would need 2/3. I think in the end, most people would consider, most senators would probably think that he did, unless he used the nuclear option, which I'm sure they're fine with. But the changes he wants to make to the rules are, in fact, changes to a distinct set of impeachment rules, all set down in writing and everything. And the question is, whether or not the provision of Senate Standing Rule 22, which controls, among other things, they're basically the ground rules of cloture and the filibuster, says that you need 2/3 to change Senate rules, which has usually meant the standing rules of the Senate, this one set of rules that if you go to the Senate Rules Committee and ask, show me the rules of the Senate, they'll show you the rules, and what you won't find in there is this other document full of rules for impeachments. Now, I had thought initially that Rule 22 of the standing rules of the Senate said, and when it required a 2/3 majority for cloture on a motion to change the rules, I thought it said change the standing rules of the Senate and address that as a document. And since these rules for impeachment don't appear as part of the standing rules of the Senate, it might not be the case that you required a 2/3 majority. And of course, Axios has, in their journalistic shorthand, misstated the case. It doesn't require a 2/3 majority to change the rules. It requires a 2/3 majority to invoke cloture on a motion to change the rules, which is a very different thing. But people make that mistake all the time, unless there was this nuclear option invoked. And I got no real reason to believe that they wouldn't do that. Anyway, here's their Axios between the lines analysis. A senior Democratic aide told Axios last week that aside from the procedural and constitutional questions it raises, Hawley's resolution would likely be politically damaging for moderate Republicans, noting that polling shows a majority of Americans want Trump to let his top aides testify in the Senate trial. Let's see. After that, a little note for you to go and read about why Republican senators don't want to subpoena Bolton. We'll skip that. I doubt very much that the Hill has something measurably different. After this came up and he started to make these threats, Politico, Burgess Everett for Politico put this piece out. McConnell tells Republicans he expects impeachment trial next week. I don't believe that to be the case. I don't think he really expects that. He may have said it, but it can't really be true. I don't think that's going to hold up, and I would bet that nobody's asking, but reporters should start asking the Chief Justice, are you planning to be in the Senate next week? Because they think they're having a trial. Of course, that could mean that he could backpedal and say, well, what I mean is, I got to move some wires around here while I'm talking, and it's making more noise than I was counting on. Anyway, I thought there's a possibility they could mean that next week they'll start haggling about and voting on pre-trial measures, or they might even begin they might even do something that they would consider to be the beginning of the trial without the Chief Justice coming in, that there would be no rulings made. They would simply be laying out more ground rules ahead of time. But anyway, I don't think it's possible that this thing would really begin. Let's see. What do we have here? Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell on Thursday told Republican senators he expects Nancy Pelosi to transmit the articles of impeachment to the Senate as soon as Friday. That's today. Setting up an impeachment trial that begins early next week. I can't imagine that really the actual trial begins. And, of course, you can send the impeachment articles. That's an interesting thing, too. You can send the impeachment articles, but do you have to send your managers? And does that complete the process as far as the Senate's concerned? By the way, also hanging out there was Lindsey Graham's proposal. Lindsey Graham's proposal went in a different direction than Hawley's proposal. Lindsey Graham was proposing to change the rules such that the Senate either didn't have to, in fact, receive the articles of impeachment from the House, or that they would deem the articles to have been received and be able to move immediately either to a trial or a vote to dismiss the charges, even without the House transmitting them to them. And I thought I'm pretty sure I did put that one aside. And why it's not immediately obvious, I don't know. But anyway, that I think was even more extreme than Hawley's. And I don't know if that's going to become necessary. But I remember I mentioned it in context of, how laughable that was for one of the supposed leaders of the Gang of 14 to go this far into nuclear territory. I'm not certain why that isn't immediately obvious. I was even sure of what the picture was that went along with this thing. Anyway, I do recall that was out there and mentioned it the other day. So this is how far they're willing to go with bending the rules. By the way, I'll give you a copy of the rules. They're out there too, thanks to the government printing office. And they are available if you know your way through the Senate Rules Committee website. You might also be able to find them, or if you know your way through congress.gov. They don't tell us a great deal. They're pretty general and broad, and apparently made to be broken as well. I will tell you this, in terms of trying to figure out the puzzle of are these part of the standing rules or what. The printout here of the what they style and maybe you can Google it this way and find them directly. Rules of procedure and practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials. That's the style of this set of rules. And they note here, revised pursuant to Senate Resolution 49, 99-2. That would have been the 99th Congress. And adopted August 16th, 1986, which tells me a little bit. It clues me into the fact that they must have been, this is a revision pursuant to this resolution. They must have existed in some form before and likely were likewise adopted by Senate resolution. And the question is, what's the language in the original version, and does it purport to be binding on future Senates, which is another theoretical question, whether or not past Senates can bind future Senates. And they had this fight in discussing the run-up to the nuclear option and discussing the validity of a perpetual Senate rule that says something like you would need 2/3 for cloture on a motion to change the rules. How is it that each new Congress, each new Senate isn't permitted to exercise its constitutional prerogative to make its own rules of procedure? That argument hasn't been as effective in allowing the Senate to change its rules by simple majority vote in the past as the brute force nuclear option version of, well, we're just going to do it whether you think we have the right or not, and we'll know that it's not justiciable, and you'll be kind of stuck with the outcome, and that'll be that. But even that by itself, the reason it's not justiciable is, of course, it relies on the constitutional admonition to everyone else that each house has the right to determine its own rules of proceeding. It's a complicated little loop there, but anyway. You can find and read this document. It's not that long. I guess a PDF of about 9 pages. The meat of it is in the first 6 or so. And not a lot to be gained by reading through it. It mostly tells you once the articles of impeachment have arrived, what to do, and doesn't say what you can and can't do without their having arrived. So it doesn't solve any of that. And after that, it's just mechanical. At 1 p.m. the following day, you start the trial, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess that could argue for a trial in the next week, or what the rules would contemplate as a trial if Pelosi actually did say, all right, fine, here's your articles of impeachment today. You could begin early next week, even though I don't think you would see the House managers arriving to begin making their case for a few days after that. I believe the articles of impeachment have to be exhibited at the bar of the Senate for a certain number of days as well for the examination of senators. But all that information is in the rules package if you care to wade through it. Another piece of the puzzle here from the Monkey Cage blog at the Washington Post, Greg sent along to make sure that we saw it. What to expect when you're expecting a Senate impeachment trial. Yes, there are some rules. The Senate can change them, and we'll see what kind of discussion they give over to how to change them. This from Stephen Smith in this morning's Washington Post. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he's lined up the votes to start President Trump's impeachment trial, but until Speaker Nancy Pelosi allows a vote to appoint the House managers to bring over the articles, that's how they get there can't be a trial. Although I think you can message the articles of impeachment over separately and then separately appoint managers, and then the managers go and introduce the articles at the bar of the Senate and leave them there on display. So that would be an interesting trick too. All right, here's the articles. We're just not sending any managers. They have another fight over that. Anyway, in the 1999 trial of President Bill Clinton, 13 Republicans were named as House managers, all from the Judiciary Committee. While we're waiting, here's what to expect. First up, senators want to supplement the existing trial rules. The impeachment trial rules, last modified in 1986, are silent on many important procedural matters, including the day and time at which the president or his counsel must appear to begin the trial, time limits on stages of the trial, and debate on any motions, whether witnesses will be called and how they will be heard, and restrictions on what Senate television cameras can show. To govern all this, once the trial begins, a simple majority of the Senate can adopt supplementary rules, including the currently contentious question of the timing of motions to call witnesses, which largely divides senators along party lines. Republicans want the Senate to follow the course set in 1999 for Democratic President Bill Clinton's impeachment trial, but back then, Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott and Minority Leader Tom Daschle tried but failed to get their colleagues to agree in advance on supplementary rules. Here's what happened. As the trial began, other senators, backed by the leaders, agreed to a set of preliminary rules. And they're linked in here if you want to look at them. Under these rules, the two sides would first present their cases, and senators would have an opportunity to question the House trial managers and the White House lawyers. Then any senator could make a motion to dismiss the articles or to call witnesses. Senators did bring both of those motions. Republicans defeated the motion to dismiss the articles, and they succeeded in calling 3 witnesses. As provided under the 1999 rules, the witnesses were first deposed. House managers then decided not to bring the witnesses before the Senate. But at least they were interviewed. And the depositions were available to the senators, too. Today's Democrats want a guarantee that they can call witnesses. Republicans say they have the votes to follow the 1999 process, which allowed a motion on witnesses after the initial stages of the process. No one knows really how the Chief Justice will conduct the trial is the next section, and that's true too. We have a good guess, though. The Constitution requires that the Chief Justice of the United States preside over impeachment trials for a president, meaning that the chief rules on all motions and questions of evidence and procedure, although he doesn't have to. So there's the answer to that. It's coming up here, but that's a bad way of putting it, meaning the chief rules on all motions, unless he doesn't want to, in which case he doesn't. So it doesn't really mean that at all. But okay, this is how it's written, meaning the chief rules on all motions and questions of evidence and procedure, although he can refer a question to the Senate without ruling. In other words, because he can be overruled by a majority vote of the Senate anyway, he can just say, you know what, decide for yourselves, which is also a weird difference between this and a real court, don't you think? Under the 1986 rules, senators must submit their questions for House managers, the President's counsel, and any witnesses in writing to be read by the Chief Justice. The House managers and President's counsel may raise objections to a question, leaving the Chief Justice to determine whether the question is relevant or redundant, or anything else for that matter. This may prove important The 1999 rules that McConnell wants to follow provide that the House and President's Counsel must limit their presentations to the argument from the record. The Senate parliamentarian will assist the Chief Justice on procedure and precedent, unless, of course, I remind you, the Chief Justice doesn't care or doesn't want to do anything controversial, and so therefore says, you know what, let the Senate decide, which would, of course, be controversial all by itself. What's the point of having you here? On the other hand, Mr. Balls and Strikes may say, I don't know, but I'm required to be here, but that doesn't mean I need to impose myself or my will or my judgment on the Senate, which I won't. The House managers and the President's Counsel can raise objections at any time. The Chief Justice will rule on most of them, but may leave for the Senate to decide. For the Senate to decide without debate, by the way. So you can't filibuster on any of those questions. Senators will certainly appeal rulings they dislike. Those appeals will be decided by majority vote. What's the answer going to be? Republicans can do what they want. House managers are itching to request witnesses. They would like to depose additional witnesses, John Bolton, say, and present new evidence. The Chief Justice would frame these issues in a way that influences pivotal senators' votes. And let's see if we can't squeeze in one more section here before taking off for our top-of-the-hour break. There could be pivotal votes and pivotal senators, that is. There are 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents in the Senate. Few believe that the Senate will convict Trump. However, some senators' votes may be pivotal on key motions. Consider a motion to dismiss the case, which the 1999 rules permitted. Let's assume that the Democrats would vote unanimously on any question, including this. The GOP could dismiss the case if they lost no more than 2 GOP votes, giving them a 51-49 majority. If they lost 3, the question would be whether the Chief Justice could cast the tie-breaking vote. Want to know whether he can or can't, or what the speculation is? Come back with us in 1 minute and find out. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue on. I have this breaking. Yeah, I guess it's breaking news. Just tapped out now by Manu Raju from CNN, right? Do I remember correctly? Yes. Pelosi makes it official. She tells reporters no vote on naming impeachment managers today. No, she said. Who's this? Birdinator. That's Haley Bird and a CNN reporter as well. So apparently no. Asked about when she will make an announcement about sending the articles, Pelosi says, I'll be communicating with my members and perhaps we'll see that. So there could very well be a caucus meeting today, possibly over the weekend. I don't know. And it may very well be the case that people read over the last 2 days that 2 people said it's time, and they panic and say, it must be time. And they tell her so, and she says, my caucus is my caucus. Next week, I will get around to having that vote. We'll decide when. But, the likelihood of the trial starting, early next week, I guess, is now near zero. Unless something changes about what she said to reporters. All right, so when we left off, we were finding out whether the Chief Justice would be able to cast deciding tie-breaking votes on matters of procedure during the trial. And the precedent is this. During the impeachment trial of Andrew Jackson in 1868, a Senate majority supported the Chief Justice when he cast 2 tie-breaking votes on procedural questions, which I guess means there was a tie, and he cast the tie-breaking vote, and somebody said, you can't cast the tie-breaking vote. And he said, well, let me ask you, the Senate, should I be allowed to cast the tie-breaking vote? And somehow a majority voted yes on that, and so that was it. The vote, the Chief Justice's tie-breaking votes counted, and the ties were broken, and they moved forward. What would happen if the chief simply refused to vote to break a tie? That's a good question. The answer, though, is easy. The motion would fail because it doesn't work. A tie doesn't do anything. On a motion to call witnesses, a tie vote would kill the motion. In that case, Republicans could afford to lose 3 Republican votes and would still defeat Democratic attempts to call a witness. We can't know for sure, though. The Chief Justice could decide to break a tie and may favor the motion to call witnesses. That would be really interesting. All this means that 2 or 3 or 4 Republicans, we're not sure what number, based on not knowing what the Chief Justice will do, among them perhaps Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney, or Cory Gardner, you all know where they're all from, right? Could be pivotal on those questions, depending on whether the Chief Justice votes and how unified Democrats remain. One or more of those Republicans could oppose their party on a motion to dismiss while still voting with their party on a motion to call witnesses. That's a possibility, too. Party strategies could matter. Party leaders have no official role in a trial. Behind the scenes, leaders can coordinate efforts on key motions. They may also coordinate party tactics on questions for the parties and witnesses on other matters. In setting the rhetorical tone for their colleagues, they could shape public views of the Senate. Could Democrats try to call Republican senators as witnesses? In principle, yes, but again, it would require a majority vote. The Senate rules say that a senator may give his testimony standing in his place. Such a spectacle would rouse many partisan emotions. Although I suspect that people wouldn't know what the hell was going on, whereas if you tried to put them in some sort of witness stand, that might rouse partisan emotions more so than answering questions in place. But an interesting point that they even address, what part of the room you will stand in if you are answering questions as a witness. At most stages during the trial, senators are not allowed to engage in colloquies or debate unless every senator votes to allow this. I imagine really it would be by unanimous consent rather than every senator voting to allow it, but who knows? Maybe they would do a roll call to ensure unanimity there. They sit quietly during presentations and the questioning of the parties and witnesses. Under the 1986 rules, the trial is conducted in open session unless the Senate votes to close the doors. If senators deliberate at all, they are likely to do so behind closed doors. Yet, senators are unlikely to remain entirely silent in public. More likely, the party's public relations staffs working for the party leaders will work to shape coverage and public views of the trial through tweets, corridor comments, and so many other ways as they have been for weeks already. Another section here, there could be wild cards. The president's former national security advisor, John Bolton, says that if the Senate subpoenas him, he's willing to testify, which may yield new evidence about the president's orders. There could be other wild cards. Democrats may be hoping that the trial will shift public opinion about the president, but that didn't happen during the impeachment hearings, nor did it happen during the 1998 and 99 Clinton impeachment process, as the Pew Research Center reports. During the Watergate hearings, the public increasingly supported removing President Richard Nixon, but of course he resigned before Congress could get to either impeachment or a trial. And I don't know, would Greg agree with that, Democrats were hoping that the trial would shift public opinion, but that didn't happen during impeachment hearings? Is that really the case? It feels to me like there was at least some slight movement in the direction of the favorability of the question of removing the president, but not overwhelming. But I felt like certainly prior to the actual hearings at all, it was still sort of languishing in the high 40s approval of impeachment and low 50s against. But now it seems to be something along the lines of 55% in favor of removal, 40% against, and I don't know, I guess 5% undecided. And that seems like movement to me, but maybe I don't have the numbers immediately at my fingertips. Greg does, and maybe he'll be wanting to discuss that on Monday. I would say note to self in terms of checking that out on Monday when we hear from him again, but I know that even if I write myself a note, there's no chance I will even remember where I put the note once the time comes around. All right. So anyway, it's been really interesting, and there's just so many places in which there's a lot of parsing going on what the rules are and what they mean. I noticed yesterday Greg Sargent talking with Con Carroll of Mike Lee's office. He's currently of Mike Lee's office, and you may know him from some of his prior jobs too. But what was the discussion here that was going on? Mark Murray had made, I thought, a rather dumb comment yesterday. Seems like Dems have made a strategic mistake in allowing the process of impeachment to overshadow the substance, including the interviews, testimony, and documents we already know. Greg Sargent replying to Mark Murray there saying, if Mitch McConnell is in the catbird seat here, why isn't he holding the vote on the rules? And that was a good question, I thought. He was basically saying, he's been out there saying, I've got 51 votes on the rules. Why not hold that vote on the rules? That would generate some real press attention on activity in the Senate regarding impeachment, which has been something that's been denied him as long as Nancy Pelosi held on to the articles, pretty much as predicted there. Why wouldn't they just simply hold the rules, vote immediately, and you could get the rules you wanted with your 51 votes, but then you would be able to satisfy Nancy Pelosi's demand and say, well, now you know the atmosphere, the arena into which you're sending your managers. That's what you said you were waiting for. So here it is. When are you going to send the impeachment articles in your managers? I mean, it would be calling her bluff, right? Why wouldn't he do that? And that's what Greg was wondering. If Mitch McConnell is in the catbird seat here, why isn't he holding the vote on the rules? Why we should all be asking that question, he said, in my humble opinion. And this is fake bravado from Mitch, since Trump wants an acquittal. Con Carroll answered him, which always is a trigger for me. Because we can't vote on the rules until we have the articles? ? And it's an interesting question. It was meant to be an assertion of the fact, but it's not one. There's no reason in the world why you can't have a rules vote. You can't start the trial, presumably, under the old rules anyway, until you get the articles. But setting ground rules doesn't require physical possession of the papers. I don't think that's right. I just think that's flat wrong. I mean, I think I would prefer that they were stymied from even setting the ground rules. I like the fact that they think they can't do it, but there's just nothing that occurs to me as part of there's precedent in the past for opening the proceedings and then having some votes, but there's no reason to believe that that's the only way this could be done. I think he's just, he's heard that. I think that's what McConnell said, and that's what got relayed to all the Republican offices, and he's just repeating that. But there's no basis for believing that that's the case. It's just one of those things that I've heard everybody who's an expert says this is what it is. But how many times have we been through that exercise only to find out, nope, that's not actually the way it works. Now, Greg was telling me in a private discussion on the side that what he was hearing was that a motion to bring forward a discussion, either a resolution setting ground rules or the resolution itself setting ground rules would be subject to cloture. But that if they had the articles of impeachment in hand, they would be able to rely on Senate rules that say that such a motion, for instance, is either non-debatable or time-limited because they're in impeachment mode over here in the Senate now, and that you would be able to operate differently. But that's, again, setting aside the reality that the Senate can do whatever it wants. So there was this objection. Greg says, well, some reporters are telling me that it would be subject to cloture outside the impeachment trial context. And I, of course, argue, well, it's a constitutional issue. Each house may determine its rules of proceedings. It's a nuclear trigger. That wouldn't it be subject to cloture? Well, cloture was supposedly the problem for judicial nominations too, right? They said that judicial nominations are subject to filibuster, subject to debate, and therefore would require cloture. And we always went along with the assumption that that was true until we didn't, right? Where are we on that now? Cloture was supposedly the problem for judicial nominations. What happened to that? Even the justification then was the same as it is now. There's inherent powers for the Senate to determine its own rules. So, yes, you could certainly surrender to the possibly correct assertion that a motion to consider trial rules is subject to debate and therefore would require cloture. Or you could do away with that assumption with 51 votes. So if you've got 51, you should get moving. You said that you were comfortable proceeding on a simple majority rules basis. So are you comfortable or aren't you? And then by the end of the day, well, he's told us he is comfortable. So go ahead. So would that require doing away with cloture entirely? No, it wouldn't. They could narrowly tailor this to and simply say, well, the precedent from here on in is that with respect to adopting rules for an impeachment trial for a president, the sitting president of the United States, a motion to consider ground rules for that trial is not subject to debate or is subject to debate for no more than 2 hours or whatever you want to cap it. And then you would establish, just as they did for the judicial nominations. You'll recall, of course, that in 2013, when Harry Reid used this procedure to impose a new interpretation of the rules, that cloture would require only a majority vote for judicial nominations and executive nominations, except nominations to the Supreme Court. That's just the way he wanted the rule. There was no particular logic to it. I think they just thought we'd like to preserve the filibuster for something as important as the Supreme Court, even though it was obvious, like, well, that's pretty ephemeral because they'll just change the wording of your motion as soon as there's a Republican president and a Republican Senate, and then they did. And that's how they got rid of the remaining filibuster on the judicial, on the Supreme Court nominations. But you can see, anyway, the point is that the tailoring of the motion can be anything you want. So you don't have to nuke the filibuster for everything in order to get rid of it for ground. I mean, that's a pretty specific situation. Ground rules for a presidential impeachment. How often does that happen? So you can make it as narrow as you want. Anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting side discussion as well. And let's see, that leaves us with other stories to get to. Let me flip back over here to Pocket. I think that's it procedurally with respect to the upcoming trial. I think we know all there is to know about the fact that we don't know what the hell is going to happen come trial time, whether that's next week or later. And all right, let's see. We can pick up on some of our other outstanding stories. Here's one other related impeachment trial related story. Lawrence Lessig, who I'm not a huge fan of, weighing in on, I think, a suggestion made earlier by Lawrence Tribe, and writing a opinion piece in the Washington Post about it. So we'll see whether he puts it eloquently. Don't allow McConnell to swear a false oath. An admonition to the Chief Justice here, I believe. Before the Senate begins its trial to determine whether the president should be convicted of the charges for which he's been impeached, the jury, members of the Senate, that is, must be sworn to service. The oath is mandated by the Constitution. Its language, set by Senate rules, requires each senator to swear to, quote, do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws. To swear a false oath is perjury. the crime President Clinton was charged with in his impeachment, of course. Yet, given the Constitution's speech or debate clause, a senator likely could not be charged with perjury for swearing falsely on the Senate floor. I guess not. Instead, it is the Senate itself that must police members' oaths, as it has in the past. Beginning in 1864 and continuing for 20 years, members had to swear an oath affirming their commitment to the Union. Often, when it was clear that a member could not swear that oath honestly, he was not permitted to take it. As Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner said, "A false oath, taken with our knowledge, would compromise the Senate. We who consent will become parties to the falsehood." As Sumner saw it, this principle extended to any truth meant to be affirmed by a member's oath of office. Under the Constitution, for example, a senator must be 30 years of age, 9 years a citizen, and a resident of the state from which they are elected. If, as Sumner explained, they do not meet those requirements, they cannot be allowed to go to that desk, meaning they could not be allowed to take the oath. Among the senators who will have to take an oath in the trial of President Trump is the majority leader, Senator Mitch McConnell. Yet McConnell has openly declared that he is not impartial about this at all. And that's a quote, by the way. Impeachment, the senator has opined, is a political process. This, he meant, of course, there, is not anything judicial about it. But however one characterized the process of impeachment, an oath is an oath. Even a majority leader, like a president, is not privileged to swear an oath falsely. And whereas most politicians are careful to avoid language that expressly declares the opposite of their pledge, McConnell has openly flouted the Constitution's clear command to do impartial justice. If others follow, it would corrupt the Senate's role in fairly adjudicating the charges. Representative Jackie, have we forgotten the pronunciation? Spire? Damn. I'll never get this right, and now I'll just note forever that I never get it right, no matter what I do. So even if I go check, I'll continue to say, did I remember this correctly? You know who I'm talking about, though, right? Well, she's called on McConnell to recuse himself. I didn't realize that. But makes sense, but I just missed that entirely. But the issue is far more serious. The real question is for the Chief Justice, who presides over the president's trial. Can he accept an oath that he knows is false? Can he seat a juror who knows he has pledged not to be impartial? I guess the problem here is, and the way I assume Roberts would get out of it if it were pressed on him, is that he would say, well, I acknowledge having heard about McConnell's remarks. What I don't know is the truth of them. I don't know that he was telling the truth when he said he wasn't going to be impartial. And now that he's taking an oath to be impartial, my assumption is that this is the truth. He didn't swear that his resistance to impartiality was true, but he is now swearing that his acceptance of the demand of impartiality is true, and that's going to carry more weight with me than the assertion that he lied without being under oath before. And I think that probably solves the problem. During the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson, this question did become a serious issue. Senator Thomas Hendricks objected to swearing in the Senate's president pro tempore, Benjamin Wade, because under the rules of succession, if Johnson were convicted, Wade would have become president, casting doubt on Wade's pledge of impartiality. That objection threw the Senate into a fierce debate until, for reasons unknown, Hendricks withdrew his objection. Well, in those days, senators got caned from time to time. Maybe that helped. That precedent should matter today. Any senator is privileged to object to any other senator taking an oath. That's right. You just ask that they stand aside, right? That's what we've been talking about. The Chief Justice would then have to decide whether the oath can be sworn honestly. Of course, he could instead say, why don't you decide if the oath can be sworn honestly? And then they would decide it, and they would decide it in favor of McConnell. So what's the big difference? Even if the chief says, well, I've come up, it's better for everybody if the chief says, I've got an actual rationale for voting to allow him to take the oath. as there seems no way that McConnell's oath could be honest. But there is. I just told you what it was. Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. should forbid McConnell from taking it. I mean, I wish this was the outcome. This is part of the reason why I'm not a big Lawrence Lessig fan. He's a Harvard law professor and everything, but this is a gigantic gaping hole in his assumptions here. Anyway, so he says Roberts should forbid McConnell from taking it. Now, I agree he should, but he won't. So, and he doesn't have to. And honestly, if you ask me to rule impartially on it, I say no. He doesn't have to prevent it at all. So whether he rules or not, the decision could be appealed to the Senate as a whole. Should the Senate openly accept a false oath, perjury, and any other circumstances, I guess, in a proceeding to determine the president's guilt? This would not be an easy question for many Republican senators. The strong distinction that they all have drawn between Trump's case and Clinton's is perjury. Clinton swore a false oath and thus had to be impeached. But then, how can those same senators accept the perjurious oath of another senator? Is the president forbidden from lying under oath, but McConnell is not? Our cynicism about politicians makes it difficult for many to even see the issue. Whatever senators say, many citizens believe most have made up their minds. But believing that is fundamentally different from accepting an open declaration that a senator will not be impartial. A nation governed by the rule of law cannot accept a plain flouting of the law. Given his words, McConnell cannot honestly be sworn to serve on the president's jury. Any senator who allows it becomes, in Sumner's words, a party to that falsehood. Well, it's an interesting argument. Were it true, it would end up not mattering, because of all the things we discussed at the opening of the show. Republicans get a big kick out of lying over things like this, and the more obvious the lie and the more egregious the offense to logic, the more Republican it makes you. Those are your Republican bona fides right there. Anyway, I don't even think it actually reaches that because, again, to me, the Chief Justice has plenty of wiggle room here. You made a statement not under oath in the past, in which you said that you would not be impartial. I ask you now, would you be willing to take an oath that would otherwise, if it wasn't for the fact that you were a sitting senator, result in charges of perjury if falsely offered? Would you now take that oath to be impartial? Yes, I would. Well, let me do it. Before I administer that oath to you, let me ask you. You had to have been lying one of the two times. Either you were lying or misleading or misspeaking, whatever euphemism you want to use here. You were either misstating your intention not to be impartial that time a few weeks ago when you said, though not under oath, that you would not be impartial, or you're misspeaking now, about to be under oath, about to take an oath to be impartial. Which one is it? And he could say, if he wanted to play along with this thing, well, sadly, Mr. Chief Justice, I have to admit that it was that time when I was not under oath that I misspoke about my intention to serve as an impartial juror in the impeachment of Donald John Trump, 45th President of the United States of America. But I have seen the error of my ways, and now, facing down that solemn oath, I find myself swayed by its profundity and do hereby declare that I do solemnly swear to do impartial justice in this matter. Oh, well, great. Excellent. Thank you for clearing that up. Phew. Case dismissed. Sorry, Professor Lessig. You didn't think this one all the way through, but that's okay. I appreciate the attempt. I'm with him in sentiment, and I wouldn't believe McConnell if he said what I said he should say. And I won't believe him if he does say it. But I will realize that John Roberts will be standing there with no alternative. In addition to which he would know he would be immediately overruled. And that tends to bother judges a little bit, that the Senate would simply vote along partisan lines to overrule his insistence that McConnell couldn't be administered the oath. So what's the real point of making this objection? Much better if he can cure the defect with some fancy logic before moving along with things. And I think he'll take that option instead. All right, that gives us one more segment to dive deep into something else juicy and interesting, and we'll make the choice of which story that's going to be over the next 2 minutes. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Once again, facing the decision of what to treat and what not to in the next half hour or so. Let's see. I'm going to say we'll start with, maybe let's go over to just security. Since I said I was going to get to this today, I think maybe that should take precedent. I teased it a little bit yesterday. The question of whether the Trump administration abused the redactions process as the process that we discovered, that we discovered being used once we saw, or rather once Just Security saw the unredacted emails between Pentagon officials and OMB officials with regard to the Ukraine aid. Austin Evers jumping in here with this piece. The title is the question. Did the Trump administration abuse the redactions process? And I hope he'll get a little bit to what that means if they did. With the Trump administration waging a total blockade on producing documents to Congress, that's the big problem here, the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, has become the only vehicle available to force the release of records related to the Ukraine scandal. For those interested in transparency and accountability, this is an important safety valve. However, as documents exposed by Just Security last week demonstrate, the administration still has plenty of opportunities to obstruct. Part of what makes FOIA so powerful compared with congressional subpoenas is that requesters can obtain court-ordered production schedules relatively easily and quickly. Thus, even as House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff lamented that he had not received a single document, material started trickling out through FOIA litigation. It started in late November with releases to my organization, American Oversight, revealing a direct connection between Rudy Giuliani and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo via the Oval Office. The House Intelligence Committee cited these documents in support of both articles of impeachment. The releases continued in late December with a significant release to the Center for Public Integrity, showing, among other things, that aid to Ukraine was frozen 91 minutes after President Donald Trump's July 25th call with the Ukrainian president. But those documents contained heavy redactions, and underneath those redactions, as we learned last week, were communications showing that the order to freeze the aid came directly from the president and that the Pentagon had serious concerns about the hold's legality. Were it not for Just Security obtaining the emails without the redactions, that information and the Trump administration's obstruction of it would still likely be unknown. Redactions, the bane of FOIA requesters everywhere, are usually legitimate, but often they are stretched to protect sensitive information and sensitive people from scrutiny. The so-called deliberative process privilege allows agencies to redact internal policy debates, such as discussions between the Office of Management and Budget and Defense Department personnel over how to draft appropriations hold language, but it is often abused. Advocates routinely deride the government for treating the deliberative process privilege as the power to withhold it because you want to. For instance, is it truly deliberative information that OMB received clear direction from POTUS to hold the Ukraine aid, a line redacted in CPI's documents, after the hold had been decided and even publicly reported on by Politico? Perhaps a lawyer for the government came up with an argument that it was, but saying that a directive isn't deliberative or is close to black letter law. That's true, right? I mean, think about it, right? Where the deliberative process privilege allows us to block out, deliberation among the members and staff of the executive branch over what to do. But a directive to do something is the opposite of deliberation. The deliberative process is over. This is what the president ordered, and whether it was done or not, that was the decision. Deliberative process is over. Decision has been made, needs to be a part of the public record, or at least isn't protected by the deliberative process privilege. Could be another privilege there. Could be a national security issue of some sort, but not deliberative process. Anyway, moreover, deliberative process redactions should not be available to hide evidence of governmental wrongdoing. While we protect internal deliberations from disclosure so as not to chill them in the future, there is no public interest in protecting discussions that violate the law. It's not a conspirator's privilege. Here, many of the redactions in the CPI release explicitly many of the redactions in the CPI release explicitly covered debates over the legality of the administration's hold on Ukraine aid. Another set of redactions masked a draft letter from DOD to OMB raising concerns. The letter appears to show that OMB's assurances to the Government Accountability Office in December that it hadn't been warned by DOD were false. Of course, the problem is how anyone is supposed to know whether redactions are masking misconduct if they don't know what is under them. It cannot be overstressed how difficult it would be to prove that these redactions covered wrongdoings without knowing what was under them. Without just security, I suspect the administration would have gotten away with them. Although I suppose here there's room for discussion about the role of judges in all of this. You can, I suppose, make an allegation, but you'd have to find some basis for the allegation. But presumably at some point, there's an opportunity for a skeptical judge, if he or she is skeptical, or can be convinced that it would be wise to be skeptical, and they could ask to review the material in camera and then come back out of chambers and say either that the redactions are legit or that they're not, and then decide what to do based on that, and leaving that decision up to one judge makes you hope that the process by which the judges are appointed to the federal bench is a fair one, and that you're actually choosing people who will feel compelled to approach the problem impartially and make a soundly reasoned legal decision, as opposed to being a Trump MAGA fan ghost hunter who got himself appointed to the federal bench for life in exchange for loyalty to Trump, and who absolutely won't approach things impartially or be capable of putting together a reasoned legal opinion. That's problematic. But you know, if you got to resort to something, you should hope that it would be an impartial judge at the very least. But that's another issue for another day. In fact, we've already treated it. So, okay. Moving on here. Unfortunately, many of the redactions in the recent Ukraine releases reveal the pliability of FOIA standards to indulge governmental instincts towards secrecy and self-preservation in ways that make it very difficult to challenge. This isn't an entirely new phenomenon. Despite President Barack Obama's aspiration to have the most transparent administration in history, and Attorney General Eric Holder's admonishment to agencies not to withhold information just because they could, many in the transparency community argued the Obama administration fell short of its stated goals. The Trump administration has been at least as aggressive in reusing redactions to shield itself from scrutiny. It also has paired its aggressive FOIA posture with a total obstruction of Congress and a refusal to engage with non-sycophantic press. It really is a war on transparency and accountability. The problem for the Trump administration is that information has come out despite its best efforts. Brave public servants defied the president and agreed to testify before Congress. Even at their most aggressive, agencies have not been able to obscure every damaging piece of information from FOIA releases. Journalists have pieced together a damning narrative of how the administration held up aid to Ukraine. FOIA releases will continue regularly throughout 2020, and Washington should brace itself. American Oversight alone has 6 lawsuits pending on Ukraine issues, and additional suits have been filed by Protect Democracy, the New York Times, Public Integrity, and others. With each piece of information that comes out despite the White House's blockade, the public is reminded of 2 things. First, the president used the power of his office to gain a personal, partisan, and corrupt advantage in 2020. And second, he has obstructed all efforts to investigate him. He's being impeached for both. Good points. Didn't get to the hoped-for discussion. Maybe Austin Evers isn't the guy to have that discussion. Maybe somebody else at Justice Security is. I'll keep an eye out to see whether we ever get to that discussion. What happens? What are the penalties? What are the processes for getting to those penalties, if any, when you discover that redaction has been used improperly and perhaps in premeditated fashion? Love to get to that story eventually. All right, let's see. Other interesting, here's a short-ish story we can add to our collection from the Hill the other day. Senate Republican blocks unanimous consent on resolution calling targeting cultural sites a war crime. Now, we heard a lot about that being a war crime, and so if true, that should be non-controversial. But of course, it is because partisan Senate. But I thought I would point this out. Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman James Inhofe blocked passage of a resolution on Tuesday that classified attacks on cultural sites as war crimes. Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts tried to get a unanimous consent request through to pass the resolution, arguing that the Senate should go on record amid President Trump's threats to target Iranian cultural sites. The president would compound the mistake which he has made and turn it into something that could be catastrophic for that region, for our country, for the world, Markey said from the Senate floor. If he had said it from the House floor, that would have been remarkable. He added that Trump's threat to target cultural sites is a betrayal of American values. It is wrong. It is a needless escalation which ignores international law. The page-long resolution states that attacks on cultural sites are war crimes. It also notes Defense Secretary Mark Esper's comments from Monday when he told reporters that the United States would not target Iranian culture sites and would follow the laws of armed conflict. Under the Senate's rules, any one senator can request for a resolution to be passed by unanimous consent, or do anything by unanimous consent if you want, but any one senator can object and block the request. Inhofe here says he appreciated the spirit of Markey's resolution, but that it needs to be more specific. And this is the interesting part. This is why I went ahead with this, because this is not news, except in the sense that it happened and we'd like to know about it. But this is what grabbed my attention. Since our votes carry the force of law, this is Inhofe, we need to be more specific in our resolutions. And it's simply not true that attacking cultural sites is always a war crime, because there are many instances in which cultural sites have been used as staging grounds for hostilities, Inhofe said. Now, to that point, I don't know whether there have been many. I suspect there probably could be some. I suspect you can always come up with a case that's close to the line. But it's pretty clear that international law considers the intentional targeting of cultural sites to be a war crime. That can't really be the objection. I mean, it is his objection that it's too unclear somehow. But I brought this up for this part. Since our votes carry the force of law, we need to be more specific in our resolutions. So I stop you there, Senator Inhofe. Resolutions don't carry the force of law. Now, your votes can carry the force of law, or rather, your votes can pass a measure which would have the force of law if adopted, but a resolution very specifically does not have the force of law. So it can't be the case that we need more specificity in this resolution because it carries the force of law. Minor thing in the grand scheme of things, but on the spot, when it comes down to, can a Republican make a coherent objection to something like this? Apparently the answer is no, and at least not Inhofe. So there you go. Inhofe earning his position as a contender for dumbest member of the Senate. He may hold on to that title. Nobody noticed, just us. But, that's part of what makes the show fun. So pocket that one for later. Okay, let's see. Other issues worth mentioning. I've been holding on to this thing for a little while because it's not hard news reporting. It's random guy who we nonetheless think makes a great point, ranting on Twitter about things. But we've read similar threads by this writer on Twitter before because though speculative, they seemed pretty solid and they made some very interesting points. At a minimum, they made points worth investigating. Uncle Blazer, or as the Twitter handle, the actual address goes, Blake's Mustache, all one word, at Blake's Mustache. So are you surprised at Blake's mustache? Well, you should be. And I know we've read one of his threads before, and he's got a couple of very interesting ones floating around in the last couple of days. This one struck me because it brings us back to an old friend, if you will, an old member of the Rogues Gallery, Felix Sater. Remember him? Here's the thread, as he introduces it. Thread. Any information Sater provided to the FBI or CIA. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the second of the two threads now, I think, that I have stored away in Pocket. Yes, let's go back to the original one to set some context here. And again, he introduces it. Thread. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And here comes the smoke, I guess. By the early 2000s, this too brings us around to Sater, don't worry. By the early 2000s, Trump had squandered all of his inherited wealth. He was $4 billion in debt and had to place nearly his entire business enterprise into bankruptcy. No bank would lend him money. That part we remember, right? Except one. By this time, Trump had done plenty of business with the Russian mob and Soviet-era mob before it. They laundered money through Trump's casinos and by purchasing condos in his tower projects. That, of course, is something we've spoken about explicitly. I don't know that much about their laundering money through the casinos, but it seems like a very likely target to launder money through. But we know about the tower projects. But with Trump completely broke, his relationship with Russia was entering a new phase. Trump's string of bankruptcies reportedly grabbed the attention of the Russian mob's boss of bosses, Semyon Mogilevich, right? We've mentioned his name before, too. See, he says, the Active Measures documentary for more on that. Trump's financial troubles made him an easy mark, as is usually the case. That's what raises red flags for people. And Russia stood ready to convert him into a full-fledged Russian mob asset. And again, remember here, that's important too. People say, well, he's not really a full-fledged Russian government asset. He's not a spy for the Russian government. Maybe, maybe not. But he could be a Russian mob asset. That has A, no formal definition, really. And B, since there's no real clear line between the Russian mob and the Russian government anyway, it has much the same effect. I thought that was very interesting. Now, he continues on. From 2002 to 2011, Trump resurrected his business empire by partnering with Bayrock Capital, run by Felix Sater, of course, a known associate of the Russian mob, on a string of Trump Tower projects that were vehicles for Russian money laundering. The Bayrock deals worked like this. You'll remember this if you've been listening to the show for a while. Trump would license his name to a tower project, and before the tower was even built, hundreds of units would be sold to shell companies controlled by Russian mobsters and oligarchs. That's the part that, I guess still needs demonstrating widely. But I think we've demonstrated individual cases of this having happened. But we certainly have come to the conclusion that, yes, that's the general way in which the scheme worked. Trump would license his name to a tower project. Before the tower is even built, hundreds of units are sold to someone, even if they're sold on the up and up for the individual buyer, like as a legit buyer who pays through legitimate means. That was the scheme, to sell as many units as possible beforehand. And then, as they say in the next tweet here, even if it's not done with shell companies controlled by Russian mobsters and oligarchs, it's still the case that the tower project would then leverage the pre-sold units to market the tower project to other investors and unwitting condo buyers who thought they were buying into a hot deal. The units bought by Russians could be churned by selling them to other Russian shell companies to accomplish multiple money laundering transactions on the same units, or they could be sold to unwitting third parties. Trump took a cut of the deals and invested almost no capital. Free money. But nothing's ever free, right? The Russian mob doesn't just give away money. Yes, they were benefiting from the money laundering, but they surely wanted more. They had significant leverage over Trump, and it was time to seal the deal. In 2008, Trump found himself unable to repay a $600 million loan from the only bank left that would loan to him, right? From Deutsche Bank. Miraculously, in 2010, Deutsche Bank decided to loan Trump money to allow Trump to repay its loan to Deutsche Bank. I think we actually read that story. Now, why in the world would Deutsche Bank do that? Remember, it was, I think he had a $600 million loan from the commercial lending department, and the high net worth individual private banking arm of Deutsche Bank decided to lend him money to repay the commercial arm, or maybe it was vice versa. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, why would they do that? Why would Deutsche Bank loan money to Trump to allow Trump to repay a loan to Deutsche Bank? What's the difference between the first and second loan that makes the first one no good and the second one acceptable? How about if the second loan is guaranteed by someone other than Trump? Oh, maybe. We've now gotten two separate reports, he says, from two separate sources saying the 2010 loan from Deutsche Bank was guaranteed by Russians. The first report said a Russian oligarch guaranteed the loan, and the second report said a Russian state-owned bank guaranteed the loan. Someone's got it wrong, if not both, right? In 2014, of course, Eric Trump admitted that the Trump Organization doesn't take loans from banks because, why? It has access to all the funding it needs for its golf course projects from Russia. That's right, he said that out loud. Golf courses, of course, make for easy money laundering. Okay. I hadn't really thought of them as money laundering operations, but I guess it would work similarly, or could work similarly to the condos, especially since you can sell memberships, right, in a golf club. Heading into the 2016 election, it's pretty clear that Trump was massively intertwined with the Russian mob. His tower projects and his golf courses were Russian mob money laundering operations, and his bank debt was likely guaranteed by some variety of Russian money. I'm quite sure both the state of New York and the House know exactly what Trump has been up to, and they are close to getting the goods. We'll see about that. This is something he tweeted back on January 4th. Let's listen to Trump's own explanation, he says, from the intro to season 1 of the propaganda show known as The Apprentice, I like that phrasing, of how he fought back and won big league after being billions of dollars in debt. Oh, wait, that's right, he doesn't say. And here is the intro, if you care to play it through. He doesn't say how he fought his way back. I don't know about you, he concludes, but if I were Russia and setting my hooks into Trump to employ him as a puppet U.S. political figure, I might think about causing someone to make a reality TV show portraying Trump as a brilliant businessman and a strongman leader. And that, too, includes in his in his last tweet a link to yet another one from a few days earlier. Thread, Putin's Apprentice, a timeline of the entanglement among Putin, Trump, and Mark Burnett. Because that's an interesting angle on things, too. That it was perhaps, if not a Russian project, in the Russian interest to actually produce The Apprentice. But how could that be? I'm just sort of wondering, and I guess he's got an explanation for it. First, he says, of course, Putin serving as a KGB foreign intelligence officer from the 70s into the early 90s. And in 1984, Trump begins, he says, money laundering for members of the Soviet-era Russian mob, with the mobsters buying condos in Trump Tower through shell companies that hide their identities. And we've explained why they would have an interest in doing that in the past, right? You take dirty money or even non-hard Soviet currency, dirty or not, and although I guess he'd really have to be doing it in hard currency, because what interest would Trump have in command economy era Russian rubles? Nothing. But anyway, you take your dirty money, you get to buy real estate in cash, because it's still allowed at that time and still today, without disclosing where it came from. You buy it in cash, and even if you lose out on the resale value of the unit, the thing is it gets sold to an unwitting third party and converted into clean money, since the original sale never has to account for where that cash came from. So, in '86, Trump gets in deeper with the Soviets, meeting with the Russian ambassador in Trump Tower to discuss Trump's political career, which hadn't happened yet, and the possibility of a Trump Tower Moscow. In '87, Trump visits Moscow. KGB is said to have sent him hookers and bugged his hotel and dangled the possibility of more money laundering deals and a Trump Tower Moscow deal. 1988, Trump returns from Moscow and launches an exploratory run for president, first time around, retaining who? Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, and taking out ads in the Boston Globe and New York Times with pro-Russia policies, saying NATO allies are freeloading and U.S. should engage in denuclearization talks with the Soviets. Way back then, huh? In 1989 through 96, the Soviet Union, of course, dissolves and kleptocracy begins to take hold in Russia. Meanwhile, Trump's casinos, mainly used to launder money for the Soviet-era Russian mob, spiral into bankruptcy, which I guess explains how a casino could spiral into bankruptcy. Trump finds himself nearly $4 billion in debt. From 1997 through 2015 era, Russian kleptocracy launders money through Trump Tower projects. Some are owned by Trump and others are licensing deals using the Trump name, but all are massive money laundering operations financed by shell companies owned by Russian oligarchs. To 1999 and 2000 era, Putin emerges as the leader of Russia, and at the same time, Trump announces at first an early run for president, hiring Roger Stone once again to run his exploratory committee, and publishes The America We Deserve, explaining that as POTUS he would focus on fair trade and stemming immigration. Trump ultimately abandons that run and then heads into the Apprentice era. September 12, 2000, NBC announces on its website it's secured the rights to a new Mark Burnett reality TV show called Destination Mir, not The Apprentice, Destination Mir, where contestants compete to win a trip to the Russian space station. So this is where Mark Burnett first comes into it and first comes into contact with the Russians. Not right away with The Apprentice, but first Destination Mir. January 28th, 2001, New York Times Magazine article entitled Survival of the Pushiest quotes Mark Burnett saying he negotiated the Destination Mir deal and Putin is involved. May 2002, Burnett pitches Trump on The Apprentice. Pretty soon on the heels after that. 2004 through 14, of course, there was The Apprentice. Trump stars in the show, falsely portraying Trump, as we know, as a successful businessman, whitewashing his image and positioning him for his run for president. 2015, ding, he runs for president. Also in 2015, Hollywood Reporter announces that Mark Burnett is pursuing a reality TV show focusing on glorifying Putin and Russia. Didn't need it, though. But there you have it. That's basically how the thing came full circle here. Burnett first becomes exposed to the necessity for dealing, probably nefariously, with Putin in order to produce his stupid idea show Destination Mir. At which point they approach him about something even more interesting, perhaps using Donald Trump as a reality TV star. You could probably make it fly, but then we learned an awful lot about how the editors thought that the program should go. It was obviously a comedy, right? No, it has to be a serious show portraying him as a serious businessman because reasons. Little did we know at that time that the reason was Putin says so or he'll kill me.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
It's an interesting theory, something to think about while we contemplate over the weekend that story we still haven't read aloud, but which I have tipped you off to about his hotel in Baku, Azerbaijan. Do read that over the weekend. And in the meantime, stay tuned for Justice Putnam and his Blue Moon Spirits Fridays edition of the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy next.